I do that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
I believe I've made you co-host.
Okay, great.
I saw that.
Okay, excellent. Should be coming up just about now.
Everyone, missed you.
Okay.
No, that bitch never leaves.
Oh. I think we have someone. All right, so all right. All right. So it's great to meet everyone. My name's Carrie George. I'm the Vice President, Head of Sustainability currently at Everledger. We'll be going into different things that I do with Everledger, but what I'm going to really just talk to you about is, basic sustainability careers, what it really looks like in the field, what are you really doing, different types of jobs and what they require, and then why I'm in my current role and a little bit about that current role. So what does corporate sustainability really look like? What I did was quickly just break down the different organizations I've worked for without Everledger included, since I'll hit on that at the very end. And just some different ways to think about it. In corporate sustainability, you have risk-based scenarios, and more legal oversight. You have different types of environmental oversight and health and safety management. And then you have more of these positive, proactive, what I'll call blue economy jobs that get into financial inclusion and positive benefits. In my career, you'll definitely see that the first column is the most often hit in jobs. Environmental definitely hits more consistently as I progress in my career. And then the blue economy, more positive impact, is something that's been kind of scattered across my career. And why that might be is, as I work more and more with corporations, they're going to hit the legal issues first, the PR risks next, different types of ethical expectations, and then getting into positive impact because they have to hit their highest risk scenarios and issues first and then moving forward. So just kind of giving you kind of a corporate Maslow's chart in that regard. And so let me talk a little bit about some of those really high risk scenarios. Well, modern slavery and human rights risks really hit at the high point of what would be considered legal risks. So you'll see that across many different countries in the world. You'll see different types of human rights legislation, and that it continues to grow across the world. It's all based in two different guidelines that I worked on when I was at the US State Department. It's really progressed to be based in the UN guiding principles and OECD due diligence guidelines. And you can kind of see how these are broken out across different corporations and what they're expected to do. I'll go into a few examples, just comparing Apple and Microsoft and some of their reporting on that. But these guidelines are long narratives that then corporations have to determine what that means in their supply chains at their factories and so on. So just some examples of some of these risks and then how they relate to those regulations. Different corporations have had different lawsuits across the globe, and they can be in legal risks. They affect PR issues, but they can also then go into further impacts in their supply chains, both for to sell like you and I, but even in government contracts and larger contracts across the globe. Regulations are not the only thing that affect corporations, but also investors. And so when I show some of this, think of the stakeholders that a corporation might be interested in. You'll have workers and their actual employees. You have consumers like you and me. You have investors, and then you have big contract opportunities like governments and so on. But in, for example, the battery or the electronic space, the EU started off in really the early 2000s, but some of the reporting on critical raw materials started coming out in 2010 and so on. And then I started being part of the team at Apple tracking this. It got international attention and PR attention when certain NGOs, Amnesty International and SOMO, released two very key reports on the cobalt supply chain, and that dovetailed and directly overlapped with a lot of media attention around battery materials generally and the critical nature of that supply chain. CD then published different papers on how the interconnection between certain human rights risks and bigger supply chain were kind of inseparable, and that we all had to address these issues. So what look like then in a job? Well, in a job, then you see that you'll have different types of risks related to, finding and addressing the supply chain actors. So in the upper left corner here, what I did was I really focused on actually identified smelters through the supply chain. And so I was tracking actors both in a very detailed way. So actually going sometimes or oftentimes to mines and smelters and different types of engagements in mineral markets across the world. But then I'm also doing research and contracting different actors overall to engage on that. Sorry, that's been blocking. Then moving forward, what we started doing is engaging in not just the tracking of materials, but then the issues in the supply chain. And you'll see here, this is where we started looking at what's maybe not legally required, but what is the intention of this legislation? What is the intention of the activists and stakeholders that are interested in? And that's when you get into the ethical responsibility. And so we started tracking and working with partners on the ground that were actually tracking incidents in these supply chains and paying into the systems to remediate them. And going back to then kind of the whole positive impact and really looking at what is the economy and the market that we want to go for, well, then that shed a lot of light on minerals overall and how do we start thinking urban mining and circular economy. So just a few different examples of engagement in the battery and electronic supply chain. Eventually at Apple for a little over 5 years, and I ended up being really interested in the jewelry supply chain because Apple and the electronics companies, well, they started really getting involved in mineral management in the early 2010-ish era, and its stakeholders and activists were putting more pressure on them at that point. Well, the jewelry companies and jewelry industry have been engaged in the industry, in the sustainability and corporate social responsibility space really since the early 2000s because of issues that have been popularized by the movie Blood Diamonds. Now, they ebbed and flowed and eventually have been pushed more into a much more aggressive role now with certain investors becoming more engaged, the OECD coming back to the jewelry industry and pushing them forward. So industry also go backwards of, big in borrowing best practices and learning from each other. You can see this in my experience with Brilliant Earth. There were a number of criticisms and claims about some of the claims they were making, a lot of potential consumer concerns and demands on, what was expected of the jewelry company and potential lawsuits as well as actual lawsuits. I was brought on after the initial, outpouring of concern about this, and I was brought on to address the risks as legal and PR risks, as well as in the ethical responsibility. And what we did was we took their basic goals, really created much more rigorous engagement across the supply chains, brought out a lot of weaknesses in some of the industry standards, and then pulled forward into that ethical responsibility. What should we do? This picture is with myself and a number of different artisanal miners and leaders that have come from all over sub-Saharan Africa, and we were engaging on some of the best practices that we really wanted to carry forward. Brilliant Earth had been actually investing in a number of activists in sub-Saharan Africa for many, many years. And this was me actually engaging with a few of them when they realized what company I was from. So Brilliant Earth had maybe got ahead of themselves in terms of really trying to get to the positive impact, and then circled back to really address a lot of the gaps in industry practices that were more of the due diligence and paper kind of tracking issues that still can be speak to some of the work that I'm doing now with Everledger to really tie up some of those gaps. But this led me to groups like NOAA, which is taking electronics materials, the precious metals, and turning them into jewelry, and then looking at how across industries we could be benefiting certain best practices. So let's talk about some of the results. When you're looking at some of the regulations that are out there, we see that there's a lot of issues how these are implemented. And if, for example, the UK Modern Slavery Act has been around for a number of years now, so you are seeing more consistent practices. So in any career in sustainability, you will likely be heavily involved in public reporting. You'll have developed policies or you're enacting policies, and you'll often have to, at least on an annual basis, report on the practices and outcomes of those policies. I was starting mostly in human rights and international development work, so a lot of my emphasis has been in that kind of social and human rights space. But slowly, because of my engagement with minerals generally, and my interests, I've become much more of a well-rounded sustainability expert, including a lot of work on environment. But you can see here that what Microsoft has done in a recent UK Modern Slavery Act report is they break down the different audits at their factories and then how those respond to modern slavery issues. A lot of these audits also include environmental issues, so they could invert that same data and that same touch point of an auditor going to a factory into an environmental report. And so oftentimes you're using similar data. So going forward to another example, the US has SEC filing requirements on conflict minerals. And I showed you an early draft of some of the data regarding going to smelters. I've engaged, as I mentioned, with a number of smelters and miners and mineral industry partners globally. And from that work and engagement, we ultimately started doing some of this work here to actually not only track the minerals, but then report out on those actors that are actually being compliant and participating in different types of risk management practices. This work is really critical when you're thinking about how do you actually have an impact in a supply chain, and it can be on any topic. This happened to be about reporting on upstream activities, and some examples of the different types requirements that many actors across the globe that have to be involved. There's a laundry list of actors and issues that you could be tracking across the supply chain. This goes to that early point that I mentioned just about actually having an impact in the supply chain, where we had a monitoring program on the ground, and you can have an audit or monitoring program and it can cover any number of standards and requirements. And in this case, we were addressing really gross human rights issues that could include illegal taxation, but then also issues of direct conflict, death caused by, conflict actors or by actors related to the supply chain issues such as, just unhealthy practices. And, when you get to the actual impact, this is when even activists will start praising by actually engaging with partners on the ground enough, which was very critical. A lot of companies actually said this was exactly what they had hoped the legislation would turn into. That, going through the paperwork, understand your supply chain, and then finally getting to the impact on the ground, really the ultimate goal. So going forward, let's talk about the skills of an average day that many you might need when you're looking at sustainability and different types of corporate social responsibility practices. You're going to be engaging with a high amount of quantitative data in the work that I've done. Not all CSR sustainability programs do, but my work has highly been quantitative at times. It's not necessarily that you have to be running regressions or anything, but you have to be comfortable with a lot of data, Excels, running some basic, macros and those sort of things should be something you're comfortable with. Qualitative research is extensive. So you'll have a number of reports that you'll probably read per day. You'll be having to scan through data and make assessments really quickly and feel comfortable on the ground, really engaging with different actors. I did a lot of negotiation, both internally as well as externally, and continue to do that. And then project management, time management, being organized is absolutely critical. Just for candidness, my work is not necessarily always that glamorous. I wear my PPE globally. I sleep in some pretty dodgy places at times. This was the third picture is me on a very tiny bus, squished in, and then I do get the benefits of also working with really interesting people globally. These are miners, informal miners in Indonesia, who were open with me about some of the risks and challenges that they face. So at any number of times, this is part of my work. I'm also in a suit and oftentimes in conference rooms, outside of COVID. But yeah, a lot of this work is not necessarily glamorous, sometimes somewhat adventurous, but I will say it's really positive work overall. I definitely encourage anyone to be in it. A little bit just about what I do now, because I was engaging with so much data, oftentimes manually having to process information, taking it from a PDF report, and then moving it into something that could be used industry wide or at least corporate wide. I started getting really interested in technology companies. Everledger is a emerging technology company that uses a host of different data and different technologies to affect people, product, and planet. And our goal is to encourage and increase transparency so that you can have a more established trust to ultimately get to the impact on sustainability. My CEO, I met when I was at Brilliant Earth. I actually hired Everledger while I was at the jewelry company because I knew we needed to really embed better systems across the supply chain. And Leanne and I have worked together for the last 3.5 years, 2.5 of which have been at Everledger. And she has been quite a fearless leader and engaging on these topics. But sustainability matters across the supply chain. As I mentioned before, world's largest asset managers such as BlackRock have publicly focused on climate. You see big companies such as Amazon and Microsoft, taking on climate pledges, but also the human rights element. So I talked a lot about the human rights aspects just because a lot of the legislation is more mature in terms of international supply chain legislation and requirements. But quickly behind it is, greenhouse gas and climate reporting, the EU taxonomy, and the EU's battery legislation. I can come back and speak another time on that, but though immature right now, because it's just coming into force, will be much more mature and have a lot of those requirements going forward. We just published last April our first product on actually greenhouse gas tracking through the supply chain. This is a big deal for me because in order to do a lot and enable the impact, the positive impact element, not just the paperwork and the due diligence, you have to get there faster and more efficiently. And so what I've been doing with blockchain and different types of AI and machine learning type of technologies is getting the data more effectively and efficiently to the actors that will then take the impact. And in this case, we're tying it to different types of offset providers globally. So you understand what your carbon impact is and then immediately can offset it instead of the lag time of gathering the data and going forward that way. And hopefully we'll get to the resource recovery, extended life cycles faster and more effectively through doing this. Just a few types of data points that I'll bring out. We have we've shown that we can not only process documents more efficiently, but also identify the risks in those supply chains more effectively and quickly. So, reviewing 41,000 documents and finding only 25 that actually had the critical errors in a fraction of time. You can see that, a manual process would be able to review maybe 200 of these types of documents per day. And we can review with parallel processes and triangulate data over 10,000 per day. And that's bringing in and time stamping and other aspects, as well as bringing in third-party reports. And this is just some data to give examples, but rather than manually processing, which I would have to have different types of data analysts go to different websites, pull in audit reports, then pull in the relevant data, and maybe we could write a script for some of it, but it would still be a process that we would have to do individually. Now at Everledger, I can do that in a matter of minutes by just having scripts written, but then pull that into a blockchain or different types of enabled services that can get that data to the relevant actors to make choices very quickly. This is all really important for a number of reasons. One, we want to be getting more material from urban sources and above ground sources as quickly as possible. We want more actors to be reselling and extending the life of products, and we need more material to be recycled overall. We can't do that without marketplaces, really effective supply chains, and being able to communicate where the material is and in what forms and format it is with the service providers. So if you're interested in circular economy, if you're interested in recycling, if you're interested in regenerative ag, technology is a huge part of it overall, and we can definitely encourage that. Good examples of just collection of ocean plastics or plastics for polyester. H&M, Adidas, and many others have been setting clear targets for actually getting recycled content into their supply chains. But that means collection and getting in massive sorting and aggregating these types of information or these types of materials, and then getting it to the actual supply chain that was already existing with virgin material. All of that is really technology based. It's a market kind of play overall. Here's just some examples of what we've been working on with the US Department of Energy, kind of in line with that we're trying to engage consumers so that when, maybe a lot of you are students, so maybe you don't have a power drill, but, I have a home and, as I'm doing different projects, I might have to replace my power drill battery a couple times every other year, but maybe I don't know where to drop it off, along with the 100 other battery types that I have in my home. We're trying to engage consumers so they can see exactly where they drop off different products for resale, reuse, or recycling, and make that really efficient, just to close the logistics gap and the knowledge gap to make circular economy programs just that much more effective. And doing good sustainability, and particularly in the circular economy, is big money, actually. So just one number to bring out: the resale electronics market is a $52 billion market. So the idea of repairing something, and maybe it's just as easy for you to buy something new, but that whole market economy around repair, it's worth something to someone. So, get it to the right place to actually be repaired and move it forward. I'll close with that, but just, I'm a big advocate of technology and people solving the biggest problems in the world. And I am looking forward to a broader conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing. Wanted to just give that overview and happy to discuss further.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Wow, you touched on so many things, and all of them you can definitely expand upon. If anyone has any questions for our wonderful guests, please go right ahead.
Hi, Carrie. I had a quick question. So thank you for your presentation. As I think a lot of people on the call are supply chain majors but maybe potentially interested in sustainability, what would you say, like, if you could just name one specific skill that would be helpful in getting a job kind of in that supply chain sustainability field, what would that skill be?
Well, so a lot of corporations, it depends on how mature they are. A company like Apple or Microsoft, they'll have, packaging supply chain experts, and then packaging supply chain sustainability experts, and now packaging supply chain sustainability and circular economy experts. So there's a lot of specificity in the big companies, and the smaller companies, you could be everything. So you could be a generalist in supply chain and kind of hit on all of it. I bring that up just because as you look at careers and different jobs and different companies, find what you're passionate about, find what you're good at, and just keep going with it. If you're a quant person and you love efficiencies in supply chain, find probably like a packaging job if you're wanting to do something on supply chain, because that's a game of numbers. It's a game of matching sizes and charts and finding the most efficient process. It's not always in the design, though it's hugely about design, but you got to be a real logistics expert to find the right materials, the right place, the right fit. So really figure out what you like to do in supply chain. If you're a negotiations person, some of my best, most critical moves were partnering with different operations people who were just incredible negotiators. And I would put them on phones with scary people that I couldn't move across the line, and they would drill them down until they agreed to some sort of sustainability goal that I couldn't do on my own. And they would couple it with commercial gains and different types of contracts. So you can really do anything and be a sustainability person in most jobs these days. A lot of the sustainability experts, like in human rights, may not be experts in the negotiations. And if you're someone who is a supply chain expert, go reach out to the sustainability and CSR teams, and just say, I want to help. Here are my skills. If you want to work in a sustainability shop, if you're wanting to do energy, for example, you will have to become somewhat of an energy expert at least, though some of the big companies hire legitimate energy experts to be negotiating utilities contracts globally, either for their retail space or their factories, setting up, solar panels and all these things. So, it's such a big swath of opportunities, but that's not giving you a skill. It's saying, what are your skills, and I'll find a place for you, or other people will find a place for you. But that's just a starting point, really.
Awesome, thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions or thoughts? We can just have this really conversational too.
I know I have a question. You seem like you spoke a lot about how your role is really enveloped in the legal aspect of it. Is your undergrad or a degree, one of your degrees in maybe legal studies or law?
No, and I probably should adapt one of the slides to say a lot of CSR jobs and sustainability jobs, you kind of get an idea of where they might have more work. Sometimes CSR jobs are actually in legal teams. And so you will be performing maybe a function of a paralegal, basically. And that can be for a lot of the human rights regulations and other things. It can also be that you're on an environmental team. So actually most of your goals are towards environmental goals. At Apple, I was in operations. So I was heavily involved in just, if a supplier was approved, that was part of the operations game and just moving it forward. But because I happened to be in the material supply chain management program when some of the US legislation was coming through on conflict minerals, I just worked a ton with the legal team. But most sustainability and CSR people will work with a legal team at some point or another. So no, I have no background as a lawyer. I just learned a lot of tricks of the trade, careful language, making sure you say what you mean and not overstating it. A lot of battles with PR to say, whoa, don't overstate what we have. And a lot of times that isn't about greenwashing. It's just their job to find the best stories and the best view. But you do have to, that's a lot of my job is also to make sure it's very accurate and to put my foot in there to make sure it's exactly what should be represented.
Thank you.
Of course.
Anyone else?
Maybe one thing else I'll offer is that a lot of my jobs didn't exist. So Apple interviewed me for an analyst job. I said no. They came back to me, said, what about this job? I said no. Then they came back to me and said, what if you were just a program manager and you decide what you want to do? And I said, okay, that sounds interesting. That was 10 years ago. So I know there's a lot of maturation that's occurred in a lot of different programs, but there's a lot of jobs out there that you can invent a lot of things, especially if you have a supply chain background and you can offer, kind of double dip and be that person that can do a lot of roles. In an ideal world, actually, most directors of sustainability would be real operations experts, real supply chain experts, so that they're understanding the practicalities of it, not just the policy angle of it. And I find that to be really effective. When I was brought on to Apple, actually, it was kind of the magical, hierarchy, and that not only my senior director, but my senior director's boss and then our COO all had worked together for decades and all were real experts in supply chain and the product and that sort of thing. So we had a lot of coordination and engagement, and that's kind of the magic. So if you're interested in sustainability and you're already a supply chain expert, find those right magical jobs. I keep mentioning packaging just because there's so many jobs out there right now in the packaging world, and it's such a huge problem that, especially, the benefits of an Amazon world and COVID are also, coupled with the negatives of so much packaging and a lack of reverse logistics other than something managed by our municipalities, which isn't enough, isn't near sufficient for what we actually need for these products and material supply chains to really get an urban, mining and circular economy going. So really interesting stuff there.
So Carrie, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed your presentation. So how could we as faculty members and in our program maybe prepare our students for jobs in sustainability? So is there kind of one or two areas that you would suggest that we really kind of bring in and that would help our students be better prepared for the kinds of jobs that you've had?
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of the work that I'm doing now is that I just I don't have the golden handcuffs of working for a big company, right? So I'm working for a small company, and a lot of the work that I have done is now public enough that I can engage with. So I would love to help students actually get much more practical internships, research program opportunities to actually understand what it is. There's a lot of small companies and medium-sized companies that are very comfortable in that space. So it's not so sensitive, but you can actually work on it, and get some of that practical experience. A lot of students may not fully appreciate that you don't have to be you're not a bad company if it needs to make financial sense. So like, you can't just kill your entire profit margin in order to do something right. So you have to be smart. And, I think pros and cons of my background, I was a dancer, I was an artist, I'm a creative thinker, I happen to be good at math. I am not a talker, contrary to this conversation. It was something I had to learn to do, but I'm a good worker. And so I was diligent in trying new things. You have to be very resilient. My teams at Apple, they were these, brilliant kids that would come from, Harvard and Stanford, and get so frustrated so quickly because it didn't work on the first try. They created a beautiful presentation. Why didn't we get it approved? Well, I mean, the reality is that I had to try 50 things and negotiate 10 times over, and that would be internally before I even got to an external engagement. So, doing good has to make financial sense. It has to work for the company, has to work for players, and it's not easy, but it's definitely worth it. So, resiliency, getting enough experience of things that work and don't work are going to be a big part of it. Any other questions? I realize I've been talking very fast, so.
So I have a follow-up question on what Professor Hartley asked, and that is there a specific domain or topic area that you think a supply chain program should have that they don't have right now? Like I think most of us have kind of a similar set. Is there a skill set that you're seeing students come out with that they don't have, I guess, or are they missing something that maybe we as universities should add to the curriculum?
Skills, I mean, so one of the interns I am working with right now, great modeling skills, in terms of, being able to work in and around data. I think, again, it's just more practical engagement, and that's not any fault of a lot of professors. You don't typically have access to the data. So I worked with MIT and Harvard, a lot of they just published several different papers and on some work that I had done with a partnership to get them data. So maybe it's also getting you guys better cases and examples so that people can work on the problems. Different types of things that I'm working on right now is helping governments to appreciate that there is a wide range of quality data, and that good enough data is often all you get. And so kind of translating the real world of, sometimes we have self-reported data that can't be thoroughly validated. How do you couple that, so that you can take on good actions? And I'll give you an example. In the world of climate management and climate mitigation, that's a supply chain practice through and through. Everything about it, if we can solve a lot of issues on climate and energy, everyone really wins. Doesn't matter where you sit, and so reducing energy is the first goal. Efficiencies in factories and other production lines, transportation, making sure it's really effective and efficient, using as much renewable energy as possible. And then you get into the measurements and the management of the entirety of the supply chain and offsetting what you can't actually mitigate through efficiencies and changes in source of energy for whatever reason. All of that can be done much more efficiently in reporting. And then there's also the shared responsibility, because ultimately the consumer as well as the brand are winning if they're getting material from somewhere, and making sure that we all share different types of responsibility. That's a negotiation. That's a play with different actors kind of agreeing to different results on the ground. And a lot of the work I'm doing is that. I will say why I bring that up is understanding limits of data, being able to still take action on limited data, and then also negotiating differently. I took a negotiations class, and the teacher, this was actually at Apple, I was the only person in the room that had a shared win result and a 10-year goal. And it's because of my thinking is not short-term thinking in terms of a lot of the impact. So if there were different skills, it's like thinking of a bigger picture, like what are the results? And that's changing a dynamic of short-term kind of shareholder thinking, and also playing with that while thinking these long-term engagements. And that's a totally different game than what we've been playing, but that's the reality of my space, to really make impact. I don't know if that makes sense, if that's helpful, but I think
that's an interesting comment. So I appreciate that, making decisions when you don't have a complete data set and thinking bigger picture. Those are harder things to teach, though. I'm not going to lie.
They're hard things to teach. And I think really the only way to teach them is through different cases. And we need better academic partnerships in the sustainability space. And, also I've been really happy with some of the academics I've worked with that have just said, wow, this isn't real data, or like, how do you make a decision on this? Or that was a total PR call, that, and we actually need that reflection, because I've seen a lot of business schools kind of operating very separately from the actors, and we need to make sure that they are getting closer to the realities, and being critical where it needs to be critical.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So let me ask another question, since no one is teach the students not to speak up, right? So in your experience, how engaged are the companies that you worked with? So when you were at Apple and you're working with vendors, where it's becoming more commonplace, I think, for large companies to have somebody in the sustainability space, and maybe to empower them to make some decisions. Are you seeing that trickle down to the smaller suppliers at this point? Or is that still mostly the domain of bigger companies where they have dedicated CSR personnel embedded in their supply chains?
It was definitely, again, it was 10 years ago when I started working at Apple, and it was newer for even Apple. I mean, prior to the wave, when they brought on my senior director at that time, Jackie Haynes, I think prior to that, there had only been, 15 people in the US that were on the Apple team. Even that grew to over 100. And so it definitely shifted, even in the big companies. I would say in smaller supply chain partners, they're usually really doing 2 or 3 jobs at once. So you might be someone who does health and safety and then be pulled into environmental issues or material management. You might be someone who's responsible for chemical safety and then also get pulled into human rights issues because of the people management angle and training. That's probably more of the practical application and how it looks in a lot of those factories and farms and things. In China, there's also like, the ACFTU, the, Communist Party's kind of worker engagement. And so there's representatives at factories from those. There's a lot of different models of how you start working with people, and you just kind of get used to working with a myriad of actors, and just trying to find enough of who does what. And sometimes you have to make up that role. If you're working for a big brand, you reach out to a factory and it's usually a salesperson, and then they end up kind of doing part of it and their legal team does part of it and so on.
You might have already kind of answered this, but if you were like a hiring manager for a sustainability position, what would be something that you would look for in a candidate? Like, what's something that would speak out to you?
The first thing is curiosity. And I'm a little bit of a different kind of manager in that I often am a little bit more demanding. I'm someone who builds a lot of programs. I'm not really good at maintaining things. So I'm the first usually to take a crack at something and build it. So I look for team members that are curious, go-getters, really can do a lot on their own, will take something to the next step. So I'm not micromanaging them. But when I ask something, they ask the next 4 questions. That takes a lot of practice as from a personality perspective. So you kind of understand each other. And then also to be able to kind of grow and develop into the person that you'll be as a sustainability expert. And so what that means is, I'll grow you to a certain place, but then you can kind of carry forward the project overall. So yeah, curiosity, independent learning, understanding enough, and then asking the next 3 questions. So I'm not doing that is a lot of it. Sustainability experts, I have friends who are in the chemical management space, in the energy space. Those are very specific subject matter expertise that you have to develop and have like proper training on and other things. I only am kind of tangentially related to some of that work. My space in just materials management has been very much a field, like on the ground, kind of learning about what works, what doesn't, reading lots of papers, what materials are hot and what materials are being mined in different places, and kind of understanding that. So it's more just being in the know and learning as you go.
So let me ask another question that kind of turns things around. Hypothetically, then, when you're approaching a company who may not have a dedicated sustainability specialist or anyone, what is it that you look for there? So, because there's a chance that some of our students might end up in that position where they're working for a small to medium-sized company, and then they're approached, what would you like to see in that engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times what I would look for when I would be working in supply chains, I would send out these, let me think of, I was trying to think of a colleague at a company, kind of like what you're describing. I sent some big bear email, why I say that is he used to say when Apple would get a little sniffle, everyone else got the flu. And so, I sent one of my big bear emails out to say, you must do da, 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 and he wrote back. And gave me some corrections on what he thought actually needed to be done, timelines, what was reasonable, what wasn't. And we ended up being really, really close colleagues and friends because him giving the reality check of what's actually possible. So don't be nervous about saying what is reasonable. Doing sustainability has to actually work. So just being an idealist and saying tomorrow we should all, be perfectly circular and everything's fine doesn't get anyone anywhere. But when you see real players in the room, think about it, give good feedback, and say what's reasonable, what's not. That's pretty phenomenal from a brand perspective, and you get noticed really quickly. Even things where it's like that's not in our commercial interests, and you've actually backtracked our conversation. So things like asking, like big companies will ask for everything in the world, and that could be like, we want to know everything about every material you ever used. That's probably commercially sensitive information, IP sensitive, and not going to be practical for. It's not going to scale. And so it was great when companies would push back, and actually a lot of times internally, whether it be at Apple or Brilliant Earth, when a company pushed back, you're like, oh, you're a real player. Let's negotiate, and so, be willing to be the smart, effective negotiator that says stop and we need to rethink something. Obviously do it with, finesse, but yeah, it's a good place to be. Well, we can keep talking, and I scanned the participant list. It looks like there's a lot of people here. If you have other questions too, if this is not the right forum, I'm happy to answer questions separately, and we can do follow-ups, on different topics as well. So I hope to make this as effective as possible. I was happy for you guys to reach out. Because I'm usually traveling in time zones, I don't always get to engage with students and different academics. So it's a pleasure for me.
Well, it is certainly a greater pleasure, I think, for us to hear you speak, especially just from a student perspective that's about to kind of take a step into the real world. It gives a little bit of confidence and definitely some guidance. So thank you. Other than that, we don't have anything else for you all this evening, but again, thank you very much, Carrie, for your valuable time and your willingness to respond even after this event. So thank you very much. And as you can tell from the comments, we hope you all have a wonderful evening and a wonderful day for you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.